Tom paused for a moment to look Mavere over. She had sat down to breakfast wearing only her dress shirt from yesterday, and he arched an eyebrow and smiled as he set their breakfast down, before turning back to grab his coffee. His store of beans was secure, and he'd made certain to bring enough to last, as long as he rationed himself. Running a mental check on his other goods, however. I should have brought more oatmeal, he sighed, looking over the pantry. Well, that and a lot of other things. He'd really hoped to enjoy more of the native foods than he had so far, but there was no denying to himself that he could be a picky eater. Just looking at his stores after 2 weeks was enough to tell the story. He was going to have to adapt and overcome sooner or later, if he didn't want to starve. Living off coffee was only good as a t-shirt, but even so... "You could try the plover again, you know," said Mavere between bites. Thomas stocked the fruit and a few things for Miz's breakfast when she could spend the night, and she waved a fork of the pasty brown fruit his way. "Good grief, no. Whichever of the 8 goddesses looks over agriculture and shill, that would be... No, seriously, don't tell me. Whatever divinity created a fruit that tastes like Vegemite should never be allowed a temple," he said, shuddering as Mavere just shrugged and took another satisfied bite. Miv made a face and waved the spoon at him. "It's very good for you. It's packed with vitamins and nutrients, and perfectly safe for humans to eat." "I'll cross that bridge when I come to it," he said, giving the fruit a doleful look before taking a long sip from his mug. He closed his eyes a moment, savouring the flavour, then looked over at Mavere, contented. "I'm glad you could stay over last night." Mavere smirked at him after taking another bite. "Not like I was going anywhere after dinner, and, you know, you never did explain how that bikini has anything to do with teaching. I think you just said that to get me to wear it." "No, I really did get it for a reason. Though damn it looked good on you." He grinned back at Mavere, enjoying the blush that crept over her cheeks. "I didn't have it on very long," she grinned. "Don't change the subject, though. Why is a swimming suit, if you can call it that, important?" "Well, it's called a bikini, of course, and there are a couple of reasons. One good and one bad." Mavere licked her lips slowly as she considered the options. It was a sight Tom never tired of watching, and he bit back a grin. She scooped up another piece of the pullover, and nodded before she took a bite. "All right, the bad one first." "Well, the bikini is named after Bikini Island. It's a pretty place on the major ocean, and it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, after the last World War, my country was looking to test its first atomic weapons. They moved in, relocated the islanders to a different island that didn't really support their way of life, and it kind of destroyed their culture." Mavere set down her spoon and pursed her lips. "The Imperium isn't the consortium," she started, but shook her head as Tom held up his hand. "No, hear me out on this. I know the consortium doesn't actually have slaves, but their contracts of indentured employment are maybe one very short step away from it. If they'd found Earth, then every male of age would have been offered a deal they couldn't refuse." "I know, Miv, and as metaphors go, it's more of a cautionary tale that's been in my mind. I know things could be a lot worse with something like that, but that doesn't keep me from worrying," he said, setting down his coffee and looking back. "Maybe I'm just worrying too much about what-ifs, but it's still a thing." Mavere nodded, studying his face, before picking up another spoonful of the plover. "All right, if you ever want me to wear that again, then you better get to the good part." Well, the bikini became a thing. When it was first introduced, a lot of folks thought it was scandalous. Way too promiscuous. Imagine that. Yes, well, over time people got used to it. After a couple of decades it became part of world culture, he said, as he grinned a bit. I guess that's what I'm hoping will happen with humanity. That we can stop being the fad species from the sex planet and start being accepted as people. So, you want to be my acquired taste? Miv said, with a wicked smile, before licking her lips. I do. Just don't make me try the plover again, Tom Warwick loved music, and in the months since he first played a song for her, Mevere had learned to listen. Usually it was something he had playing on his pad, and he could skip over dozens of songs until he found the one that suited his mood. He rarely sang at first, as if he were self-conscious about being caught in the act. It happened occasionally when he was focused on something or thought she wasn't paying attention, but he sang more often as he'd come to relax around her. She'd had time to get back to her rooms after their breakfast, get ready, and now she listened to him hum as they walked to their first class together. As far as she could tell, music was a perfect barometer for his mood. They were a few weeks into the return trip to Shill before she started to ask questions. It was important. Tom had said as much, and so she'd chosen to draw the information out slowly and carefully. One evening, he described his father as a good singer, while on another he revealed that his daughter had been one also. The memories of his daughter brought him sorrow, and he sighed afterward. It had been gentle and quiet. It wouldn't have hurt so much to hear if she hadn't understood the wealth of pain behind it. As she gathered the bits and pieces of his life and brought them into focus, each one gave Mevere new insight into just how lonely he'd been. Music had been his only companion after the death of his family, and over the years he developed the unconscious habit of humming along, or singing to lyrics only he could hear. Mevere asked about the unfamiliar melodies, and teasing out their meaning had taught her even more. Tom possessed a reasonably fine voice, and while he occasionally hit a flat note, it was usually strong and clear. Listening to her man sing became something she treasured, above all when he was happy. This morning there were no words, only the melody. The cadence was steady and measured, neither happy nor sad. Students crossed their paths as they drew closer to the hall, and while he nodded greetings, after every exchange the tune seemed a bit more heartfelt. Stress relief, then. Not that I blame him. It's his first time teaching like this. You practically threw up after your first class, Miv. Something was definitely on his mind. Was that your singing? Oh, it's an old tune called The Boxer. Sorry, I guess I'm a little anxious. It's about combat sports? Tom, it's not going to be that bad, she teased. Ah, well, it's more about a man who takes on a new challenge. His life isn't what he imagined it would be, but he doesn't give up. She paused and nodded at that. I like that, and you're going to do fine, Professor Warwick. She smiled then, and pulled open the heavy front door. Pegarth Hall was one of the original buildings on campus, and the old doors tended to stick. Between being sized for a Shilvanti and their general reluctance to open, Tom had opted to let her get the door after their first few visits. If Pegarth was old, it had mitigating virtues. The floors were thickly carpeted. The classrooms were well-appointed amphitheatres. Teaching in Pegarth meant comfortable surroundings. Mevere pulled Tom aside as more girls brushed past. Most nodded their greetings, although more than a few cast looks his way. Tom, can you do something for me? I know it's your first day, but it's the first day for some of these girls too. Could you please wait 5 minutes? I want a few words with the class before you come in. There was a flash of concern on Tom's face, but she nodded at another group of passing students. One was openly staring, and Mevere drew herself up and frowned. Young lady, don't you have a class to be at? When she looked back, Tom grimaced. Okay, I get it. I'll go get some water and join you in a couple. Mevere watched Tom make his way to the offices. He still seemed to have a spring in his step, so all was well. She turned away and entered the classroom. As expected, there were 12 girls present, chatting to each other or sitting quietly. The social dynamics of a class spoke volumes. Who sat where, who was in front, who was sitting alone. It was an invisible language, but one she could read as soon as she got a sense of the girls. They stopped talking as she moved to her desk. Good morning, ladies. I'm Professor Mivere Pelavon, and I want to welcome you to Practical Humanity 101. Mivere leaned back against her desk and studied the girls. Most were focused on her, though she caught one or two anxious glances to the door, and she sighed inwardly. They were all good students, but girls would be girls. Yes, there will be a real-life human for you girls to ogle. Mivere slowly swept her gaze over the gathered students, taking them all in and letting the lingering pause get their attention. Professor Warwick will be joining us shortly, but before he does, I want to have a few words with all of you. As you know, the Professor is a human male. If some of you haven't seen him around campus, it's clear that you've all heard that he's here. There were one or two quiet giggles, and Mivere arched an eyebrow. Before he joins us, I want to lay out my expectations. Professor Warwick is just that, a professor. You're to show him the same respect as anyone else on the faculty. Anything less is unacceptable. The girls all nodded, but Mivere wasn't finished. As co-professors, we'll be presenting you the comparative history of human development. For the first 45 minutes of the class, I'll be teaching early Shilvanti history and culture. For the second 45, Professor Warwick will be teaching comparable human history and culture. The last 30 minutes are for questions and answers before we break at noon. There were a few blank looks as the girls digested that, and admittedly, she wasn't certain how well the class would work herself. For Tom to teach humanity like a human seemed apt in principle, but the method he explained was unorthodox. Since what he intended was so different from standard Shilvanti teaching practices, they designed the tests to accommodate both styles. She had no idea how well it would work out in practice, but at least she had a way to adjust the grades if it didn't work out at all. During the question sessions, I expect you to behave. You will not forget yourselves. Do not ask Mr. Warwick anything you would not ask your fathers. That received the expected reactions, and she gave her next words emphasis. There are two areas that I insist upon. First, I want to remind you that Professor Warwick is from a world recently added to the Imperium. He intends to be open to any questions, but you should know there are elements of personal tragedy for him in those events. While the selected readings will vary, for the rest of the term it's preferred for you to discuss the arrival and the incorporation of Earth. If needs be, you may discuss these matters as the landing and the occupation. Referring to these matters as the liberation will be very poorly received. As ladies, this will show your respect for his feelings, both as a male and a human. Second, I want to stress that your questions should remain applicable to the class material and discussions. As ladies of the nobility, you are here to learn. Two of those lessons include showing manners and decorum. Failure to demonstrate those qualities will not be on any test, but I can assure you they will be reflected on your student appraisals. Am I entirely clear? The message seemed to have sunk in, and Mivere gave a slow nod. Very well. Professor Warwick will join us shortly. Now, I want you to open your text for this week and turn to Chapter 1. Over the next 2 weeks, we will cover the comparative industrialization of Shil and Earth. The silence was palpable when Tom entered the classroom. Mivere was just putting the daily lesson up on the screen, and he took a moment to look at the students, who were looking back to a girl. The intensity was almost chilling. Okay, you're at an all-girls school in Shil and there are 8 women to every man, but some of those girls look like you're their dinner. Mivere might have been reading his mind. She glanced his way and gave him a slight smile. It helped as his thoughts stopped racing. Settling down at his desk, he looked up again. After reviewing the student biographies, their faces were familiar, though he was having trouble with their names. Names weren't his forte, but to make matters worse, Shilvanti names covered a huge range. Thankfully, Many professors use spreadsheets to display the pictures and names of their students. While there were only 12 in the class, Tom took out his own, vowing to learn all the girls over the next few days. Mavere cleared her throat when she finished setting up the presentation, and after a few extra moments to satisfy their curiosity, she launched back into the lecture. Tom turned away from the girls to watch. He'd heard the material before, but it was still interesting now that they were presenting it for the first time, and Mavere was a gifted speaker. Best of all, staying focused on the screen kept him turned away from the girls. While Miv wasn't looking their way, at least half had struck a pose. 3 had definitely winked. Mavere's lecture came to an end, and just behind him, Tom could hear the sounds of pads being shuffled on desks and people stretching. It was his time to speak, and he closed his eyes, humming the funeral march before shaking himself. At least they don't know the damn tune. Stop it, and get a hold of yourself. Good morning. Good morning, ladies, he said as he stood and looked up. Perched just above him in the trees, 12 hungry lionesses looked down at their prey, ready to pounce and rend flesh from bone. He could feel his heart hammer in his chest. The room seemed far too quiet. The air felt hot. Alright, the room was hot, but it felt even hotter. He reached back to his desk, took a drink, and closed his eyes. Somewhere out on the plains of distant evolution, his inner prey animal screamed, "This isn't going to work. Game over, man." It made no sense to be this nervous. This was far from the first time he'd given talks or lectures. It's not like I can just imagine them all naked. He nearly choked on his water as he strangled the laugh. It's ridiculous. It's apt. No, damn it, that's just wrong. It's... alright. So fuck it. I needed a laugh. Tom took another breath, turned around and looked up again. 12 young women sitting in various poses of interest and expectation looked back down to him, ready to listen and learn. He took a step forward, held his hand slightly to his side, and oh so slowly turned around. "My name is Thomas Warwick, Tom for short. I'm told you're to address me as Professor Warwick, while girls in the 3rd and 4th year are permitted to call me by name. If you have a question in class or the office, call me Professor. That said, once I become more comfortable, we'll see about Tom. That's just my preference, and I expect I'm the only one around here." He paused and looked over the class. Most looked surprised. A few looked nonplussed. The twins, good God, they really are twins, beamed back attentively. One girl seemed to be fidgeting, uncomfortable in her school uniform. Unlike the others, it wasn't a very good fit. Well, it didn't take long to notice the difference in how everyone dresses. Thank God Miv got me the suits. As you can see, I am a human. The study of humans is new, and, understandably, we are unfamiliar to you. During my travel to Shill, I reviewed the materials on the datanet. It is largely garbage, and should be forgotten, which means this will be a study unlike anything you've had before. We begin at the beginning. Leaning back against his desk, he nodded towards Mavere. Socratic teaching is generally by rote, and very similar to teaching methods used in the Eastern culture of my world. I am native to its Western culture, and I will be teaching you using a practice we call the Socratic method. I will call upon you to answer questions, and you will answer them. You will call upon me with your questions, and I will answer in return. Question and answer, leading to question and answer. I understand this is very different from giving you a lecture, as Professor Pelavon does. Why am I doing this? It's because she will teach you the facts, while through my questions, you will learn to teach yourselves about humanity. By my questions, I will develop your understanding of the vast, complex, and sometimes contradictory relationships that make up my world. Tom started to walk, occasionally looking at the girls as they seemed increasingly uncertain. At times, you may think you have arrived at the correct answer to my questions, that you have arrived at a conclusion about humanity. I can tell you from this moment that you will be reaching for a mirage. You will never reach a final, ultimate, and correct answer about humans. On one hand, I would not presume to represent the opinions of my entire species by doing anything more. On the other hand, I would fail to present how complex we are if I did anything less. Humans are curious, and so there will always be another question, another outlook, another perspective. Put 3 different humans in a room, and you will soon have at least 5 different opinions. So there will always be a question and an answer. There will always be another question to follow the first answer. That is humanity. Professor Pellevin will teach you the facts about humans, and I will teach you how we are. The Socrati came to Earth to teach us your science and technology, to uplift us, to make us part of the Imperium, to teach men not to take their shirts off. He paused. There were at least a few nervous smiles. While he didn't return one, he still got a kick out of watching the class turn deep purple. Yes, we are different. And I have come from Earth to the Imperium to teach you about humanity. Most of the surveillance feeds were trained on the objective, who sat at her desk and took notes. Multiple perimeters extended around the objective like nested soap bubbles, and at the moment, everything looked clear, all the way out past the academy proper. It was a job for 2, with an officer on duty and one of her sergeants. As Tom Warwick started talking, the control room was packed with nearly 2 pods of Death's Head commandos perched around the room. Captain Biona was sitting on the left seat of communications, while to her right, Sergeant Diani was checking the surveillance feeds. It made the room cramped when Setan and her 2 podmates asked to sit in, but Biona didn't mind. If anything was getting on her nerves, it was Diani's chewing. While she was diligent about checking the monitors, the other half of Diani's attention was definitely on the human, and there was the damn snacking. The woman was not a quiet eater. He looked nervous at first. Don't you think he looked nervous at first? Whispered Relan. You don't need to whisper, Sergeant. We can all hear each other. Biona rubbed her forehead, but she couldn't fault her. The objective was in the class, and the classroom feed was the only thing worth watching. Well, I just thought he looked nervous is all. He's doing pretty well now. Looking pretty damn good, too, said Diani with an earthly chuckle. I know I wouldn't mind seeing him out of that suit. You don't think he's too old? Piped Relan. Sergeant Jelk was Relan's podmate, and leaned in to snag some of Dia's snacks. Girl, you're the youngest one here. He may be older than you, but he is definitely not too old. Shush, I can't hear. Satan was perched just behind Biona's chair, and frowned at her 2 podmates. Keep it quiet anyway. Biona and Yala need to work. What's this sarcastic method he's talking about? Relan was whispering again. Biona looked over the board. The 2 pods working covertly both showed green, and she settled back to watch. He said sarcastic method, I think. Anyway, it kind of sounds like the field readiness classes we had during officers' training. You really don't think he's too old? Clark Houghton closed the door of her room and tossed her schoolbag on the bed. She felt her lip begin to tremble again, and very specifically ordered herself not to cry. After all, what she wanted was in that bag, where her equipment had recorded everything during the class. She hadn't even wanted to be noticed. Not really. That was the whole point, wasn't it? She tried to blend in with the rest of the class when she got there, saying hello and bumping fists with the others. Most of the others. Her lip trembled again, and she wiped away the first tear angrily. Most of the girls had been nice enough, but not all of them. When she'd come over to say hello, they looked down on her, talked about her in front of her face. "Oh, I didn't think they were letting first-year girls into this class." That had been bad enough, but then they looked over her body, their gazes moving pointedly over her clothes, the size of her breasts. They were all smiles, but their words cut like knives. "Don't worry about the uniform. I expect you'll fill it out when you go into it." They hadn't even pretended they weren't laughing at her when they turned away. She'd had hard times fitting in before, but this was worse. Raw. She'd been made to feel small before, but never so utterly worthless. Clark sat down beside the bag and looked at her hands. She wanted to think about the recording, the lecture, about organising her notes as soon as she finished the mountain of homework she had to do. She wanted to think about anything but the girls in class. She fell back on the bed, her humiliation today ripping open 100 wounds in the past with sickening clarity. Central editing never said why they wouldn't put her forward, but there it was. She was the short girl, the one who was only good for the backup jobs on the reserve desk, the woman with a girl's figure, and that was the only reason she was even here. No one was ever going to give her a chance to be anything that mattered. Hot tears rolled down her cheeks as she curled up and sobbed. It was a good 20 minutes walk to reach the biology building. The little one-story classroom was off in the woods and attached to a greenhouse. As he stepped inside, Tom looked around. No one else was there, and he fumbled with the air conditioning a moment, dropping the temperature before wandering around the room. The view of the woods was certainly pretty, and he sighed with relief as the air conditioning started to kick in. The lush forest around the campus was well groomed. Just outside the picture window, almost trees and almost palms let daylight through the canopy over a profusion of flowers and almost ferns. It was a nice place, and he'd walked out twice before to store the chessboards in one of the cabinets and make sure he wouldn't get lost finding his way there. Tom pulled out his omnipad and looked at the time. He wasn't late. No one had come. Drawing in a breath and letting it out, he looked around a second time. The hard seats were all identical, and none looked particularly comfortable. The tables looked sturdy but serviceable. Obscure tools filled a long bench, while plants filled a sealed cabinet that stretched the length of one wall. He walked over and peered out the window. No one was on the path. There wasn't even anyone in sight. Ah well. 3 classes a week, 2 hours each. Aside from that, I get to work on the exhibit with Mevere. Office hours for students, and this. 3 hours a week. "Feed me, Seymour," he muttered as he looked at the plants. They didn't talk back, and he almost wished they would, just to break up the silence. It would be a heavy understatement saying the morning's class wasn't the resounding success he'd hoped for. Sure, he'd filled out his 45 minutes, but the questions had all gone to Mevere. It was humbling. Oh, the girls looked at him often enough, but no one had asked him a damn thing. Tom looked at the chairs and pulled over one that looked the least uncomfortable, for no reason in particular. Sitting down, he looked back out for the sign of anyone coming up the walk once more. Still not a soul in sight, and he hunched over. So much for the class this morning, and so much for the chess club now. Scrunching down in the chair, he rubbed his chin, trying to take stock of things. He was light years from home, knew fewer people than he could count on one hand, had no useful contacts, and was completely invisible to his students. That made him utterly useless, and while Mevere was a hell of a consolation now, how long would it be before she began to see him as a burden? This was his next 3 years. 3 shill years. He closed his eyes and shook his head. What the fuck am I even doing here? The empty classroom only met his question with silence, so he pulled out his omnipad and flipped through the menu. It was still broad daylight, and he rebelled at playing Bob Seger before sunset. He scrolled down the list a bit further before it caught his eye. There was no one around for a mile, so no reason not to enjoy the acoustics in the empty room. Tom dialed up the volume, laid his head back, and listened for a while before he began to sing along. Am I alive, or thoughts that drift away? Does summer come for everyone? Can humans do what prophets say? If I die before I learn to speak, can money pay for all the days I lived awake but half asleep?